June 19, 1944, Philippine Sea, 0445 hours. The horizon was still a thin line of silver when the first Japanese scout plane broke through the morning haze. Its engine hummed steadily above a quiet ocean that masked the violence to come. Below, far to the east, a formation of dark shapes moved across the water in disciplined silence, long, flat silhouettes that blended with the low light. To the observer in the cockpit, they looked like the familiar outlines of American carriers the Imperial Navy had faced before, large, slow-moving, predictable. He radioed a simple report back to Fleet Headquarters. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening, just enemy carriers advancing. But the scout pilot had misread the scene. These were not the old Yorktowns or the battered remnants of earlier American task forces. The ships below were Essex-class carriers, faster, larger, and more lethal than anything the Japanese command had prepared for. Within the next few hours, the Imperial Navy's confidence would turn into disbelief, and then into silence as the truth behind those shadows revealed itself. And that moment of misjudgment would mark the beginning of a disaster from which the Japanese fleet would not recover. By early 1944, the Pacific War had shifted decisively in favor of the United States. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once dominant after Pearl Harbor and early Southeast Asian victories, faced mounting challenges. Its most experienced pilots had been lost in the Solomons, at Midway, and in the long, grinding campaigns across the Central Pacific. The training pipeline for replacements could not match the demand. Recruits were pressed into service with minimal flight hours and almost no combat experience. Meanwhile, the United States had fully mobilized its industrial and technological power. Shipyards in the Puget Sound and along the East Coast were producing Essex-class carriers at an unprecedented rate. Each ship could carry more aircraft, launch and recover planes faster, and sustain damage far beyond what Japanese doctrine anticipated. Radar technology, improved anti-aircraft systems, and coordinated carrier group tactics meant that these ships were not just larger, but fundamentally different instruments of war. Japanese naval intelligence, constrained by doctrine and overconfidence, underestimated the Essex-class threat. Reports from reconnaissance missions were often dismissed or misinterpreted. Commanders at the combined fleet headquarters still believed American carriers would behave predictably, grouped tightly and vulnerable to conventional attacks. They did not anticipate that the new American carriers could project air power over hundreds of miles, striking with speed, coordination, and deadly accuracy. As U.S. carrier task forces steamed toward the Mariana Islands, the Imperial Navy's complacency set the stage for what would become one of the most lopsided aerial battles of the war. On that morning in June, Japanese scouts saw only shadows on the horizon. What they did not know, what no one in Tokyo expected, was that those shadows carried the full weight of America's industrial and technological advantage. The Japanese command structure in 1944 remained rooted in tradition, rigid hierarchy, and an unyielding belief in decisive battle. Admirals and staff officers clung to doctrines developed in the 1920s and 1930s, when Japan's fleet was the largest and most modern in the Pacific. They assumed that the American carriers were fragile, overstretched, and vulnerable to conventional strikes. This overconfidence blinded them to the reality of the Essex-class carriers, vessels that combined size, speed, and durability in ways that Japanese planners had not encountered. U.S. fast carrier task forces organized under Admiral Mishcher were approaching the Mariana Islands with precision. Task Force 58, composed of multiple Essex-class carriers and their accompanying cruisers and destroyers, had perfected coordinated strikes. Planes launched in waves, guided by radar and well-practiced flight decks, could hit targets hundreds of miles away before Japanese forces even knew they were under attack. Each carrier was a floating airbase, designed not just to survive, but to dominate in the open ocean. Japanese reconnaissance remained limited, relying on slow, vulnerable scout planes. Reports were delayed, and by the time they reached Tokyo or the Combined Fleet headquarters, they were filtered through layers of interpretation and overconfidence. The commanders saw the American ships approaching, but interpreted them as ordinary carriers, unaware that these vessels were equipped with radar-controlled anti-aircraft batteries and fast-launching flight decks capable of sustaining continuous offensive operations. This miscalculation would prove fatal. The Japanese Navy expected a fight that resembled previous engagements, but what awaited them was a new kind of warfare, one where technological superiority, pilot training, and industrial might combined to overwhelm even Japan's most seasoned commanders. Within hours, the Japanese fleet would learn the harsh reality of underestimating the Essex-class carriers. Technological superiority. The Essex-class carriers represented the pinnacle of American naval engineering in 1944. At over 880 feet in length, each ship carried more than 90 aircraft, far exceeding the capacity of older Yorktown-class carriers. Radar systems allowed American pilots to intercept enemy planes long before they reached the fleet, a capability the Japanese scarcely matched. Flight decks were wider, catapults stronger, and deck crews trained to launch and recover aircraft continuously under fire. In battle, this meant waves of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes could strike relentlessly, overwhelming defenses before any coordinated Japanese counterattack could form. Human advantage. While technology gave the Americans an edge, trained personnel made it decisive. U.S. Navy pilots had benefited from extensive carrier-based flight training, years of gunnery drills, and simulated combat exercises. Unlike Japanese replacements, who often received minimal preparation, American aviators entered engagements with discipline, coordination, and confidence. Flight deck crews moved with precision under extreme pressure, repairing aircraft, refueling, and rearming planes at a tempo that kept the Essex-class air wings operational even during sustained attacks.
Logistical and industrial power. Behind the Essex-class carriers stood a vast industrial machine. U.S. shipyards, supported by wartime mobilization, produced carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels at unprecedented rates. Supply chains for aviation fuel, ordnance, and spare parts ensured that carrier task forces could operate far from home ports without losing combat effectiveness. Japanese forces, by contrast, struggled with fuel shortages, aging ships, and replacement aircraft that were increasingly untrained and obsolete. This logistical advantage meant that when battle erupted, the Americans could sustain pressure while Japanese forces burned their remaining resources in futile counterattacks. These three dimensions, technology, human skill, and logistics, combined to make the Essex-class carriers not only instruments of war, but symbols of America's industrial and tactical dominance in the Pacific. Japanese overconfidence. By 1944, Japanese naval doctrine remained rooted in decisive battle theory, the belief that a single, concentrated fleet action could determine the war. This overconfidence blinded commanders to the evolving nature of American naval power. Reports from reconnaissance planes were routinely downplayed, and analysts assumed that the American carriers were predictable and vulnerable. The Imperial Navy expected conventional engagements and dismissed the Essex-class carriers as merely scaled-up versions of the older Yorktown class. This misjudgment would prove catastrophic when reality struck. Tactical realities. The U.S. Fast Carrier Task Force employed innovative tactics that exploited Japanese weaknesses. Radar-directed combat air patrols provided continuous surveillance, while layered defenses allowed U.S. pilots to intercept attacks far from the fleet. Strike waves were carefully sequenced to maintain pressure, ensuring that Japanese ships could never regroup or counter effectively. In contrast, Japanese carriers operated with limited reconnaissance, delayed communications, and poor coordination. Their aircraft, often outnumbered and outmaneuvered, were easily neutralized before reaching American targets. moral and psychological dimension. Beyond machines and strategies, the psychological edge favored the Americans. Japanese pilots, aware of the rapid depletion of experienced airmen and the unreliability of replacements, carried fear and doubt into every sortie. The sight of massive, well-organized American fleets only reinforced their sense of inevitable defeat. Conversely, U.S. crews understood the stakes, but were buoyed by rigorous training, confidence in their ships, and the knowledge that industrial support would sustain them. This calm, calculated morale allowed American forces to act decisively, while Japanese units faltered under pressure, amplifying the impact of every tactical advantage the Essex-class carriers provided. These combined angles, Japanese misjudgment, tactical innovation, and psychological resilience, set the stage for a decisive confrontation that would demonstrate the full destructive power of America's new carriers. June 19, 1944, morning, Philippine Sea. The first American strike waves lifted from the Essex-class carriers just after dawn. Fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes formed into precise formations, their engines cutting through the morning haze. Japanese radar had detected some movement, but could not identify the scale or speed of the American fleet. The Imperial Navy, confident in its numbers and veteran pilots, anticipated a standard engagement, a manageable confrontation they had survived before. The reality was starkly different. American radar allowed flight decks to launch aircraft in continuous overlapping waves, each group hitting Japanese formations with perfect timing. Pilots from the Essex-class carriers executed coordinated attacks, diving on enemy fighters and bombers with lethal efficiency. Japanese air crews, inexperienced and overstretched, struggled to intercept these precise waves. Many aircraft were destroyed before reaching effective range, their pilots overwhelmed by both technology and American tactical execution.
By midday, the American carriers had seized total control of the skies. Japanese formations, once confident in their training and experience, were in disarray. Torpedo bombers and dive bombers, the fleet's primary offensive tools, were intercepted long before reaching effective range. The Essex-class carriers' radar-directed fighters tore through attack waves, reducing hundreds of aircraft to flaming wrecks in the ocean below. Japanese commanders realized the unthinkable. Their carriers were vulnerable in ways previously unimaginable. The Hyo and Taiho, two of Japan's most modern carriers, were critically damaged. Explosions rocked their decks as bombs from U.S. dive bombers struck fuel and munitions stores. Crewmen scrambled to contain fires that spread with terrifying speed. Communication lines between ships faltered, leaving scattered units isolated and unable to coordinate defense. Meanwhile, the Essex-class carriers maintained relentless pressure. Aircraft launched, recovered, refueled, and struck again with precision timing. Japanese anti-aircraft fire, already ineffective against radar-guided attacks, failed to halt the American waves. Even experienced pilots were shot down or forced to abort missions, leaving the remaining crews demoralized and disorganized. By late afternoon, the battle's outcome was clear. The Japanese fleet had lost air superiority entirely. Several carriers were sunk or disabled, their air groups destroyed or scattered. Admiral Ozawa and his staff struggled to maintain order, but the strategic advantage had shifted permanently. Within hours, the Japanese Navy, once confident and cohesive, was rendered nearly powerless, its remaining forces retreating under the relentless pressure of American technology, coordination, and industrial might. The Essex-class carriers had not only survived their first major engagement, they had demonstrated a transformative power that would define the remainder of the Pacific War. The aftermath of the Battle of the Philippine Sea was immediate and staggering. Japanese losses were catastrophic. 300 aircraft destroyed, 3 carriers crippled or sunk,
and hundreds of trained pilots lost in a matter of hours. For the Imperial Navy, the human cost was devastating. Seasoned aviators, the backbone of Japan's naval air power, were now irreplaceable. Replacement pilots, already undertrained, could not fill the void, leaving the fleet increasingly vulnerable to subsequent engagements. On the American side, the Essex-class carriers emerged almost unscathed. Skilled crews executed damage control seamlessly, while radar-directed fighters prevented most Japanese strikes from landing on deck. Task Force 58's planes returned repeatedly, refueled and rearmed, demonstrating not just technological superiority, but the logistical efficiency that allowed U.S. forces to sustain continuous operations far from their home ports. The psychological impact on both sides was equally profound. Japanese commanders were stunned, their belief in predictable engagement shattered. Reports from the fleet describe it a perfect storm of destruction and an unimaginable scale of losses, underscoring the shock of realizing that the Americans' industrial and technological might had produced an overwhelming advantage. Meanwhile, American sailors and pilots, though aware of the destruction inflicted, also recognized the unprecedented nature of the operation. Essex-class crews understood that their success was not only a victory of skill and training, but also a testament to America's capacity to project overwhelming power across the Pacific. As news of the engagement reached Tokyo and Washington, the consequences began to ripple through command centers. Japanese high command, once confident in their ability to counter U.S. advances, now faced the stark reality that the balance of naval power had shifted irreversibly. Within hours, plans for further offensives had to be reconsidered, and the psychological weight of defeat began to shape strategic decisions across the Pacific. The strategic consequences of the Battle of the Philippine Sea were immediate and long-lasting. With Japanese air power nearly annihilated, the Imperial Navy could no longer project force across the Central Pacific with any effectiveness. The loss of trained pilots and functional carriers forced Japan into a defensive posture, abandoning the offensive ambitions that had driven campaigns from Midway to the Solomons. Kamikaze tactics, once unthinkable, would soon emerge as a desperate measure to compensate for the imbalance created by American technological and industrial dominance. For the Americans, the battle confirmed the Essex-class carriers as the cornerstone of naval strategy. The combination of speed, armor, flight deck capacity, and radar-guided coordination allowed the carriers to sustain repeated strikes with minimal risk. Task Force 58's planes returned repeatedly, refueled and rearmed, demonstrating not just technological superiority, but the logistical efficiency that allowed U.S. forces to sustain continuous operations far from their home ports. The broader Pacific campaign also shifted. The destruction of Japanese carrier aviation accelerated plans for the Marianas invasion, setting the stage for the liberation of the Philippines. Japanese commanders, acutely aware of their inability to contest American air superiority, began to prioritize the defense of homeland waters over distant outposts. The cumulative effect of these losses forced a reevaluation of strategy across the Imperial Navy, creating an operational paralysis that the United States would exploit in subsequent battles, including Leyte Gulf and Iwo Jima. By the end of the day, the full scale of American dominance was clear. The Essex-class carriers had not only survived their first major engagement, they had altered the course of the war. Japanese naval doctrine, once built on confidence and decisive battle theory, was exposed as outdated and insufficient against industrialized, technologically advanced forces operating with coordinated precision. The Battle of the Philippine Sea marked more than a tactical victory. It revealed the transformative power of industrial capacity, technological innovation, and disciplined execution in modern warfare. The Essex-class carriers were not merely ships, they were symbols of an industrial nation's ability to project decisive force across vast oceans. Their presence reshaped naval doctrine, forcing adversaries to confront the stark reality that numerical parity alone could no longer guarantee survival. For Japan, the battle exposed the limitations of overconfidence and rigid strategy. Doctrines developed in the 1920s and 1930s, based on decisive fleet engagements and superior pilot skill, could not withstand the combined pressure of radar-guided attacks, coordinated strike waves, and relentless logistical support. The psychological toll on Japan's command was immense. Within hours, the belief in the invincibility of the Imperial Navy had crumbled, replaced by fear, desperation, and strategic caution that would shape the final year of the Pacific War. The Americans, in contrast, demonstrated that success depended not solely on weapons, but on integration, technology, training, and production operating in unison. Sailors and pilots knew their advantage was rooted in preparation, discipline, and the industrial might of their nation. The Essex-class carriers became icons of a new kind of naval warfare, where speed, precision, and endurance mattered as much as courage or numbers. Ultimately, the battle underscored a broader truth about warfare and history. Dominance is rarely won by chance. It emerges when innovation, strategy, and relentless execution converge. The Japanese fleet's sudden collapse in the Philippine Sea was not just a loss of ships and pilots. It was a turning point that accelerated the Pacific Campaign's momentum, reshaping the course of the war and leaving a lasting testament to the transformative power of industrialized modern naval warfare. The Essex-class carriers had not only survived, they had changed history.